This is here where we start our recurrent neural network part of the lecture. Have about an hour for this. I hope that we can cover it in a good way. Now, we just talked about autoencoders, and they have the function of compressing a representation with a structure that converges and diverges. Now, what recurrences can do is they can produce sequences because the state now refers to the state in the future. The problem is that in a recurrent neural network, you're using the same weights for every time you're using your output of the network as an input of your same network. You're basically using the same weights you had already. Hope you can see this without further ado. Maybe a little picture here helps. So in a recurrent neural network, as you already saw in one of the projects, the neurons go back into each other. And if the neurons all have a certain activity, so then let's call the neurons A1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, A1 to A8. And so your activity vector is represented by A1 to A8. Your adjacency matrix here is the W that represents these connectivities, and you remember it from the previous project that you've gone through. Now, when you multiply the vector by the matrix, you get another activity vector, right? So if this is a time t, this is a time t plus 1 for discrete type neural networks. Doesn't matter if it's continuous, a little bit different, but very similar. Now, the thing is that this transformation here is the multiplication by the W. The W is all of the time the same. So whenever you're trying to change a weight, you change a weight not only for the now, but also for the future. So you're basically reusing the same weights over and over and over again. And so with a static network, you have some intrinsic dynamics because you're actually mapping the past into the future as a combination of what the past was. That's why the recurrent neural networks have the capacity for sequence generation and, in fact, also memory. The reason being is it tries to associate the past with the future via one unique network, via one unique connectivity matrix. Flying by here, we talked about connectivity in the project, so I'm not going to belabor this. The idea is that you have matrices as networks. Was already explored, and you said you've done the project, so I'm not going to go deep into this. But ultimately, you have these kinds of networks, and a weighted recurrent network is what we most commonly handle here. For your reference, the different kinds of random graphs and what they represent, weighted graphs. So this is how you construct a graph from correlations. In this case, it's a gene expression network. You can also create a network that represents which genes participate together. Same way you can do it with a neural network of the brain. In fact, a lot of people measure simply activity in fMRI, say, for example, of different areas, and to find out how the network is actually structured, what is called a functional network in fMRI. What one does is one computes the correlation in activity levels, blood. In the case of fMRI, we're going to talk about that in the next elective. If you do, but if you don't, doesn't matter. So you have activity areas in the brain, and when they correlate at a certain time, you say that they're strongly connected functionally, and you can then recreate a network via the correlations between the activities of the different areas that you might be measuring from. And so you obtain from the measurements of activity here, say S1, S2, S3 are different moments in time in which you're measuring activity of the brain, and G1, G2, G3 are the activities of brain measured as blood oxygenation levels. Then you have correlations between these different these different activities. You can threshold simply say, okay, so what the large ones become connected in my network, and I have now a functional representation of a connected network. It can be directed or undirected. So this is the way that you construct networks that represent real networks in the brain. So you can create them by hand as well, or by computer. The example I just gave you is how you create a network empirically. And we've been using these mechanisms to represent here and reconstruct networks of the brain. Some of these you see from the diffusion tensor imaging examples. We obtain then these adjacency matrices. They look like matrices, right? So this is an adjacency matrix from functional connectivity, as I just explained, for the macaque cortex, and these are the connections that we see here in A. And the strongly connected, you can see here that there's a module of areas that are both columns and rows, or areas in the brain, the same ones, obviously matrix, VP is connected to VP, and so forth and so on. MT is connected to V1. For instance, you can read out of this that V1 is connected to MT. And you can see that it's modular because there are these blocks here. I guess that you've probably already looked into gene expression networks, and so you might have seen these modular things. I take the opportunity to ask you in the chat, have you seen matrices like this before? And can you see where the modularity is? Yeses or nos, please. Yes or no, or zeros and ones, as you like to answer, just for me to sample where you're at. Okay, there's a no there to start off. So if the person that answers early answers with a no, that means that no one else actually has ever seen this. As a nanobiologist, this is something you probably will encounter in the future. Happens also in brain science. Now I want to know, so I only got one response, so please, if you kindly add your response to the chat, I would like to know. Don't remember. So if I hope to make this memorable now, as representations of how genes are correlated to each other, how they play to each other. We've seen similar graphs. Yeah, I was expecting that at least some of you will remember it, and it will become more relevant as you go into the future, as you're making complex models of interactions between genes, for example. Many of these things are done through adjacency matrices. Okay, same thing in brains. Is the explanation clear about how to create an adjacency matrix from activity data? Good. So I'll take the first answer as representative of the crowd. And so you have propagation. You already saw this in the project, so I'm also not going to go through here in detail, but I do want this slide to at least have the equations. So this is it, what we discussed in the project before. So if you give a certain initial state to the network, a recurrent neural network will keep that state. And it will keep that state because it's mapping that onto itself. Now, it might die off sometimes, it might continue to go, and that's a function of the weights and the initial condition. So that means that whenever you have propagation and activity that feeds itself, you induce dynamics on the network. And that's the core of what I'm going to tell you about recurrent neural networks. Not so much like to train attention networks, but to understand how these dynamics leads to particular cognitive type functions. So what can it do? What can recurrent neural networks do? It can generate patterns. And we talk about those patterns over time as spatial temporal patterns, as, to make a long story short, attractors in the network. So attractors in the network is the spatial temporal patterns that the network generates. If the network, you know, given a single state and say it dies off, I mean, all the activity goes to zero because the weights are small, for example, that zero silent state is called an attractor. It's an odd. And so it's a state that propagates itself in the future where every single neuron continues to have zero all the while. in opposition, you could also have the reverse. And the reverse is giving you then, so I was talking about the, oh, I cannot do this, damn it, apologies. Generating the patterns as ongoing spatial temporal patterns that are not simply the trivial attractor, which is quiescent and where L neurons are 0, but that's also an attractor. So spontaneous dynamics, it continues to create something. The brain has spontaneous dynamics, and it has spontaneous dynamics because the networks are recurrently connected. It encodes sequences as attractors. The network is able to be trained to reproduce particular sets of activity. This is easy to think about if you're thinking about a ring network. We talked about ring networks before, but just to remind you, if you have 3 neurons that project one to the other, they're natural, and say you have sufficiently large weights, and here we have neuron 1, 2, 3, and these are their activities, and say we start with neuron 1 as being the active one, then by virtue of the multiplication, you produce over time an activity of the neurons. This is given sufficient weights, right? And given the appropriate transfer function. You have a sequence 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now this is very useful to create robotic movements, for example. In this trivial case, it doesn't happen, but obviously if you train the weights accordingly, you can create a network that will produce from certain beginnings, certain ends. You can have multiple coexisting recurrent neural networks, multiple modules, each of which produces its own sequences. You can activate those sequences in different ways. So it can encode sequences. It can retrieve memories. So this is an example that I'm not going to belabor, but is in the lists for today. It's going to be a HOPFIELD network, which is an auto-associative network. And what it does is what is called self-associative pattern recognition, or content addressable memory. I'll say a couple of words about it in a moment from now. And dynamical reservoirs. So think about a very large recurrent neural network that is random. And you give it a random input, and it does random things. The surprising thing is that you can train the outputs of that network to produce very meaningful things. And this is what is called the dynamical reservoir in recurrent neural networks. A very interesting concept. I'm going to be talking about it in a short while. Another thing you can do with recurrent neural networks is you can put them in a robot. And if you put a recurrent neural network in a robot, the robot will do something. So say that the output of that network is, for example, the activation of a joint in a motor of that robot. So as the activity goes up and down, or there's a sequence of the activity, that joint is being activated according to the value that you observe. So this is an agent environmental loop, or the sensory motor contingencies, the idea that the brain is embedded in a body, and because it's embedded in a body, when you have inputs to your retina, to your arms, to your sensors, they are actually parameterizing a recurrent neural network, which is basically your brain, which produces a dynamical system. And let's not go there here, but a recurrent neural network has its own attractor structure. Let's just go through here, dynamical system into attractors, which is basically what network sequences are inherent to that particular recurrent neural network. And then you have an output of the network to a body via actuators, motors, wheels, joints, muscles, an eyelid, which then parameterizes the input of the network again. So this is an ongoing loop. The agent environmental loop is a coupling between the agent and its motors and the agents and its sensors via its brain. It's a way to conceptualize what actually brain processing is. It's a metaphor, but a pretty good one. What we can do, so I definitely recommend this paper with two neurons recurrently connected. And here you have a recurrently connected, this is a continuous time, two neuronal network. So dynamical systems perspective on agent-environment interaction. Definitely recommend this paper. The idea here being you have a little recurrent neural network, and it has only two neurons in this case, Y1 and Y2. And so the structure of this particular network looks like this. In green, neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 1 maps to 2, neuron 2 maps to 1, neuron 1 maps to itself, neuron 2 maps to itself. That's basically the equation we just saw before. Before you ask me, so what is this meaning that a neuron maps to itself? Going back to the representational layer, when we're talking about neurons with sigmoidal functions, very often people take them to represent entire areas of the brain. It's a very valid, just a very valid assumption. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I definitely recommend books such as this, How to Build a Brain, to discuss these kinds of assumptions. And so if you have a two neuronal network, you can control robots to produce sequences of activations, just as we talked about before, to, for example, get an insect to walk. Actually, I just said two neurons in the slide before. This happens to be a 5 neural network. Maybe next time I'm going to use a 5 neural network as an example. And then you have here sensors, that are the angles that are getting input to this network, and the actuators, which are basically the joint angles of each of these wiggling legs. This diagram is a two-dimensional robot, but this has been used also in three-dimensional, fully embodied robots. I'm not going to show videos, there's plenty in the internet. And what you see then here is that a recurrent neural network can then explain how a central pattern generator that creates meaningful gait or meaningful walking patterns on insects can be explained by recurrent neural networks such as these. Coupling between the agent and the environment is required because the input to the agent is its own output. No? So the next state also. Many questions lurking here. If you feel like asking one, please pump it into the chat or raise your hand. The kinds of questions that you might be thinking about is, oh, but if the agent is always driven by its own input, then it doesn't have any volition. Then you can simply argue, add a little bit of noise, and then the agent is going to do something different every time. The single gate then can be explained in these output spaces. In this case, these are the three. The central pattern generator produces a trajectory in the recurrent neural network that is effectively a sequence, or so-called a limit cycle, that creates this ongoingness of the walking pattern. It's a closed cycle in this case, just like the spike, right? So in fact, it's interesting to think about the relationships between the single network, small recurrent neural network that continues in time with the Hodgkin-Huxley. So these are then projections to the output space, but I'm not going to go in this in detail. This is just the idea that if you have six stages of walking, they can be represented in these phases of the three-dimensional limit cycle representing the central pattern generator. Now here, we have constructed a recurrent neural network to produce a central pattern generator by tuning the weights in an appropriate way. What you can do instead is you can evolve networks by using artificial evolution, or so-called artificial evolutionary robotics, to produce these behaviors, to create recurrent neural networks and select them as a function of certain fitnesses. For instance, here what I've done, so this is evolutionary robotics, and allow me to go quickly across some slides. You get a genotype that produces a developmental plan that creates a brain, a recurrent neural network, that when embedded in a robot creates behavior that, given a certain interaction with the environment, will have a capability or not. Then you will select the competent individuals. Then you will reproduce the competent individuals, and you will get next generation genomes. Now, all of these can be symbolized by in artificial evolution. So actually genetic algorithms embody this idea of evolutionary robotics. So genetic algorithms are the main core of most of these evolutionary procedures. So you probably heard about genetic algorithms before. If you haven't, I urge you to look into them. But the difference here is that we have a body that we're putting the recurrent neural network to, and we have a fitness function. So these are used instead of backpropagation or together with it. Could be used together, but generally used by themselves. And I'm going to show you an example now in a second. So this is evolutionary robotics. You can have training, you can have error as well, alloyed, but it's basically then they operate as different modules. But it's a very interesting question, and also possibly and maps onto larger space out there. So this is the pseudocode for evolutionary robotics. So you have P0 is a set of initial structures, adjacency matrices. Like you can make the genotype equal to the adjacency matrix, for example, the connectivity matrix, then the recurrent neural network. Start at T0, which is your first population, and then you reproduce your first structure. You vary it a bit. You add connections, remove connections. You evaluate the output of that recurrent neural network via an embedded algorithm. And then you can select the ones that work. And you can carry on doing that every time. A fitness function could look like this. In this case, it's a fitness function that I will use for the robot I'm going to show you in a moment, which is basically a function that represents feeding. The robot is feeding on its sensors. The more it feeds on its sensors, the happier it is. So let me show you the robot. Again, actually, I think that the video is better, but let me show you this first, and then you will understand more things. In the top, you have a little yellow sphere from where rays are projecting onto a sphere that is bouncing on a frame. This here represents a head, and it can do two motions. It can do pitch, which is up and down with the head, and yaw. You will see this in the video. And there are 9 input sensors here that are basically photoreceptors and retinal photoreceptors with a certain receptor field. And for example, if the robot is looking at the ball, it can have patterns that would look like these 3 by 3 input spaces. So this robot has 9 photoreceptors, super simple eye, super simple neck, so simply up and down. And we want him to follow the ball. In the channel videos, I have a couple of examples of one of the agents that evolved. So he has a recurrent neural network that is connecting its sensors to its actuators, and this is a network after the evolution. So there's a lot of questions lurking here as well, but ultimately he is looking at the ball as the fitness function says he has to. So this is his quality criterion. He can reproduce the more he's able to keep the ball under sight. You can think about that as, you know, any metaphor in the biological world out there, and you can create fairly complex fitness functions as well for different kinds of robots. But this robot is a competent recurrent neural network that takes in that input and in its recurrences produces that sequential behavior of following the ball. We can also analyze the network afterwards to see exactly what are the features of this network, what are its attractor landscapes, what are its dynamics that produce this kind of behavior. I'm going to show that in a moment to you. Before I go there, I want to show you one more video of another kind of robot that has also been evolved via artificial evolution. And it's for the Star Wars fans out there. So this one also has a set of sensors and motors, and it's a holonomic robot, and its task is to kick all of the balls in the field outwardly. Why? Don't ask. I mean, like, the question is here, abstract evolution, right? So what we have is that the robot is going around. He also has two sets of motors and has been evolved to do that, and he can do that. So if the world produces the problem of evolution with certain constraints, with, say, for example, in order to feed, you have to be able to go and get the ball. And when there is no ball, you go and get another. This is a fitness function that represents the viability of that organism over time and over the world. So what we would like to then understand is how the recurrent neural network produces the behaviors. And what turns out is that I'm not showing you here the structure of the network. I'm showing you the dynamics of the network. And the dynamics are such that you have the motor, you have an input pattern, which is 9 input pixels. And you have an output on the output units that are controlling the neck motor and the neck motors, like the yaw output and the pitch output up and down, and the yaw output. And what you see here is like network iterations. This is a discrete time neural network, so you have 50 iterations, 60 iterations of the network, and it's going up and down quickly. It's basically producing an output frequency that can be seen as activation of motors. If you look at the activity of the output units by themselves, you will see that this network is upon the presentation of this pattern, it is producing a closed cycle. And there's a lot of details here, but just to give you a sense, a closed cycle, a periodic attractor, whose meaning when confronted with the world is a motor output that looks down. That is the integrated activity of the output units. So the yaw output unit is basically balancing itself out, so for the left and right. And the pitch unit is saying more often go down. That makes sense, because if you look at the sensor, it represents a ball that is centered in the visual field of the robot. So going left and right is right now not relevant, but it's already on the bottom half of the visual field. So the receptive field of this network, then, entire network, is inducing an activity of the motor output that is pushing the neck on average down. It's a lot of details here. So these are used. Okay, so there's a lot of details here that I'm not going to get into now, unless you ask specific, and I'm happy to. Interesting details. Multiple kinds of activities lead to same outputs. So this is to say that the network, one network to one pattern, can have different types of activity over time. And so time is going in the Z direction, and Y and X are the outputs of the motors. So going from time, basically the activity of these sequences are creating them in 150 time steps. The average output of all of these networks is very similar. It's one network. The average output of all of these different sequences, these different trajectories in activity space, amount to the same average action of the robot. So the robot, in this case, he will be looking down and left, and that's how he is able to center the ball into his visual field. But he's able to do that in using different kinds of activity. So the brain also doesn't always solve the same problem with the exact same brain activity. The brain activity varies, but what we see is the same. So cat might not have the static representation of our brain, but it is recognized nevertheless as a cat every time around. It's another way to look into this. This is the so-called attractor landscapes. And the idea here is that we can project the input space directly on the output space via the recurrent neural network, and then see what the robot will do to all of the possible configurations of the ball and the sensor. You may or may not be able to see this, but if you're having a map of X and Y, so these are effectively the receptive fields of our network, have to do very much with what we just saw in Playground as well, TensorFlow. The idea is that balls that are low mean you will look down, balls that are up, you look up, balls that are in some random places, sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down, averaging out in the end. And left and right very clearly. So if the ball is to the left and you want to track it, you have to go to the left and vice versa. So ultimately, the robot does something very obvious, but through its recurrent neural network, it's able to solve the problem in non-trivial ways. For example, it can search for the ball because it has spontaneous dynamics. It can blink, and in fact, that's one of the experiments that I'm not going to show you, but it's really cool. So the robot, if I give him a momentary lapse of sensor input, he's still able to follow the ball for a little while, and so forth and so on. So recurrent neural networks, when they're connected, they have attractors. And I want to show you how these attractors might look like. This is a paper in the 90s. What they've done is the following. 500 neuronal units, and it's discrete time recurrent neural network. So these 500 neuronal units are connected randomly to each other according to certain criteria about the way it should be, some Gaussian and not very large, but connect them together. Then you give this network a specific input. You say, think about a piano. So you have as an input, you press a bunch of keys randomly together. What will the network do? That's the question that the authors asked. So you have a 500 neuronal network. On the panel A, you have the the average input, the average output of all the units of the network. So if you have 500 units, you just average their activities. If their activity is going from 0 to 1, their average is going to be some value close to 50. And you see here that the average is oscillating about a mean. So your recurrent neural network is going up and down in their average. But it does look like there's some structure in this 500 neural network. Then when you present that input as a pattern, a chord, plum, into your piano, you effectively constrain your network to something more specific. So if you present an image of a cat, you're probably going to see the cat and think cat. And so that's because I am presenting a stimulus that is constraining your system to see certain things. If you present an abstract curve, you will see that abstract curve. It will constrain your recurrent neural networks in your brain to have that input. So that input is essentially, to use the jargon from neurophysiology, clamped. On the right side, on the right panel, is another representation that's quite beautiful. It's called the first return map. So here we're plotting the activity of the average activity of the network in time t against the average activity of the network in time t plus 1, the first return map. So just to make perfectly clear, what we're plotting there is the activity of all, the average of all of the neurons. We're plotting it at time t versus time t plus 1. So when the network has a certain state, its activity, say for example, at time t, the average is this value. And after you compute the network one time, it will have another value, maybe it's here. And so you will have a pair that represents where did the network go. It started here, ended here. If you give the same value once again here to the input, it has an output. So maybe this guy maps to unfortunately it drove rather symmetrical, but imagine that this guy maps into this new state, and this new state maps onto another output state. And so for every input state, you will have an output state. And so you're creating this cloud of points that represent input-output relationships. And this is then the first return map. Which is a way to look into the activity of high-dimensional recurrent neural networks. Only projecting 500 dimensions to 1. And you would think, wow, what can I see here? Well, what you can see is what they published a paper about. Before you introduce a specific input to this network, your point cloud, there's a couple of things to see. First, it is not random. The recurrent neural network here is sufficiently structured that the cloud of points that is produced is sprawling a certain manifold. So the average activity of the network is in a lower dimensional space already. Hope you can see this. So the cloud of points that you see here and the densities mean the network likes to be in that position. Maybe neurons 1, 5, and 10 like to be very active, and so we have a point here in this average activity space that represents that particular part, that particular pattern in that sequence. You continue to do this, then from a certain moment on, you produce the stimulus and you create stimulus force dynamics. It reduces that point cloud that was already in a lower dimensional manifold to an even lower dimensional manifold that in fact looks one-dimensional. So the beauty of this result is to demonstrate that random neural networks, when presented with specific random stimulus, gives us something specific. It gives us the attractor structure of that network. Different inputs will produce probably different sequences, different stimulus force dynamic paths, if you like. But even if they're going to be different, they're going to be constrained to the possible space of activities that that specific recurrent neural network has. So it's a little bit like our brains, no? You have, so I have my brain. When you present me a cat, I have my associations. I have my own patterns. If you present me a slightly different cat, it's going to be a slightly different pattern in my brain, but it's nevertheless going to map onto my notion of cats. If we think about different brains, all of them are going to see cats. I mean, if they're not blind, and the attractors themselves across the brains are going to be different, but they're all constrained. And they're all constrained by the stimulus in similar ways. And in order to recognize and understand each other through Wittgenstein, we actually need to find a symbol that represents our experience. That's how language works. But this is just parenthesis side, not particularly relevant to what I'm saying now. The main point here to take home is that a random recurrent neural network will have its own activity patterns that it likes to generate. And if you give it an input and you coerce it to a certain input, it's going to only explore a certain subspace of that entire space of the network. And the beauty is that years later, 10 years later, so this is a paper in 2010, so it's 11 years later, that theoretical result has been then validated by this important paper in Nature Neuroscience, in which people show that stimulus onset quenches neuronal variability. The idea here is that when you put a monkey, a mouse, a human in a chair and you give them specific input, the activity in their brains have reproducible structure that reduces the variability of spiking neuronal firings. So here in this case, you in A, B, and C, we're representing three possible hypotheses about what are the trial-to-trial variabilities in firing rates. It can be if you present the stimulus 4 times that the responses all reduce the variability by converging into 1 pattern only, by converging into 4 patterns only, or by having substantial variability and converging into it. But more importantly, I wanted to focus on the right side of the slide, where you have actual data from multiple experiments where the variability of the network computed with the Fano factor. The Fano factor is essentially the standard deviation divided by the mean of the noise, so of the activity of these networks. And what you then see is that for every case in which people produced a specific input to a primate or a cat, you see a reduction of variability as measured by the Fano factor. So in this panel here, you have a moving grating and you're measuring activity in V1, reduction of the Fano factor. In this here, you have an oriented bar, you measure it in V4, you have a reduction of variability. In this here, you have 2 moving gradients here, like the 2 grids that slide over each other. You have activity in MT that reduces their variability. Each of these is a paradigm testing a particular sensory capability of the human. I'm not going to discuss all of them, but the astounding fact is that presenting a stimulus reduces variability of the cortex, has been predicted in the paper that I showed you before via from theoretical considerations. So 1230, flyby Hopfield neural networks, and I think, let me actually invert the order of presentation. I want to tell you about reservoir networks first, because now you've been primed for reservoir networks. We're going to look into Hopfield networks as the last thing. It's going to be a little bonus. Now, you have a recurrent neural network. Let me see if there are questions so far. You have a recurrent neural network, and this randomly recurrent neural network has patterns. How do you use them? How do you make them do things? How do you have these random patterns really working for you? 2 researchers about also actually 10 years, no, 20 years ago now, Markram, working from the perspective, Maas and Markram working from the perspective of theoretical neuroscience and neurophysiology, and Herbert Jaeger working from discrete neural networks, as I was showing, they came up with these insights that we shared now. The recurrent neural networks have attractor structures. Stuff is happening, and it's high dimensional. And maybe we can use that random activity to do something specific. As I've shown you in evolutionary robotics, what selected the structures was evolution. But say you have a recurrent neural network and it remains random. Can I use those high dimensional spaces to do something? If you input stimulus, now you know that you're going to go into a lower dimensional space. Here, the echo state network, if you see the structure where my cursor is pointing, is a recurrently connected neural network that actually also has self-connections that are not displayed here, that has output neurons. The connections between the blue neurons are all random, but the connections between the orange neurons are trained, and they're trained via linear regression simply. They're not even trained, they're calculated. The same way as you decode the population activity from Nengo, in fact, these are related ideas, you can train outputs of a randomly recurrent neural network. Let me see if, first I'm going to draw a picture in the iPad of what a recurrent neural network looks like. And then I'm going to bring you back to the reservoir networks proper. So this is your bunch of neurons that are recurrently connected. There are some conditions how these connections should be, but we're not going to be bogged by them. They're random. And you have some input. And the input is distributing over the whole population. And you have an input. And initially, your weights are random, and you're getting them from all of the hidden neurons. In this case, our network is computed as the previous ones we had. So the activity of neuron J at time t plus 1 is a combination it's the linear combination of the sigmoidal function of the weights that are projecting onto neuron J from neuron I times the activities of neurons I at time t. So all of the neurons here are doing like this. It's a discrete time recurrent neural network. And what you can do is you can train the output weights. You can find the values such that you have a supervised specific output that you might want to get. Think about one neuron only for the time being. So if you have a single output neuron, and you want, upon a certain stimulus, say, for example, stimulus is 1, 0. Why not? I mean, you're saying, say that the stimulus is a categorical stimulus, and say you give 1 to this input neuron here and 0 to this other input. And you give this, you clamp it. It's like a constant input, okay? And that constant input is going to enter into this network and is going to propagate and inactivate other neurons. Or initially, the activity on the output neuron is something random, some sequence, and in this case it's continuous, but you know that this network is discrete, so just maybe many time steps, and so it looks like that. If you have a desired output that you want to produce, say for example you want to do a sine wave, then what you need to do is you need to find what the error is for every single time point here after you finish, and use them as training points into a linear regression algorithm. Basically, you can compute the weights directly if you have these training points. So basically, what you do get is you know what is the output that you want. So you have a matrix that you're going to, so your matrix of output weights that are going to be multiplying your input from the hidden layer. So so you have the output weights that are going to multiply your input layer, and you want to do it such that the least squares constraint is encountered. So you can solve then W times H equals the output we want. And so you can, this is the problem you can solve with linear squares, and you can obtain this directly via the inverse. I mean, you all know about linear regression, so I'm not going to belabor that. But this is the problem you have, and this is the problem you can solve with linear regression. And so your recurrent neural network effectively becomes a pattern producer, even though its hidden layer is randomly connected. And so what I'm showing here in this plot is an echo state network, which is a reservoir type network. And here you have one input neuron that can take 1, 2, 3 there's been given 4 different values in different durations, clamping. So first this much, then this much, then this much. So over time, it's an input, so basically as a value. And as the recurrent neural networks, when they're presented as neuron, they're producing some sort of funky behavior. But the output, we trained this linear regression problem to produce sine waves of different frequencies. So basically you have, say, 4 inputs, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are frequencies. And then you train the output to produce 1, 2, 3, 4 hertz. And so you have a method to create frequencies as a function of constant input. This is useful, for example, in a motor system. And this is an echo state network that has been trained in 2 output dimensions with an input that asks it to draw an 8. This is a very used to be a very hard problem. And the funny thing is that it's simply a recurrent neural network, and you can read out the output weights to produce that particular sequence. So this is a reservoir network. Last thing I'm going to say today, and there's a couple of things I didn't cover in the course. You might notice them, and if you ask me, and I hope that you're also going to cover them in the project. But alas, we have the time we have. And I wanted to finish off with an example of an ultra simple recurrent neural network. The HOPFIELD network was one of the first recurrent neural networks to be created. And it looks like this, without the spinning wheel of death. These are then input and output and processing units all the same. So these units are McCulloch-Pitts type units, so they have a threshold function, so they can produce activities of either 1 and 0 or either -1 and 1. And HOPFIELD imposed the constraint that the connections between any 2 neurons is symmetrical. So what does a network like this do? It's a little bit like an autoencoder. Oh, I think that so this is how the HOPFIELD network works. And the question is, what does it do? What does a network that produces 0s or 1s and has symmetrical connections, what can it do? Well, I was telling you about attractors all the time here, but I didn't discuss like attractors in depth, and there's no way to do it. But what you can know for a fact is that if you have a network that is connected like HOPFIELD presumed, the network has all attracting fixed points only. What does that mean? It means that the configurations of the input space, that if you give an input to that network, the output is a constant. It's a constant vector. If you have 10 neurons as an input, you're going to have 10 neurons as an output, and over time, those are going to be the same over and over again. Turns out that if you train the network via heavy learning, and I'll tell you in a moment how, you can store patterns in that network. You can make it such that for patterns that are similar but not identical to the pattern that you've stored, if you give similar patterns as an input, the network returns the similar pattern as an output. This is why I presented you the autoencoder, is so that you can think about the idea of why is it that a network that has symmetrical weights can reproduce what's been given, or effectively denoise. Well, you train it by simply giving an energy function that when neurons are coactive, strengthens their connection. So basically, this is essentially Hebbian learning. 1243. I wanted to introduce it. These are Hopfield networks, and this is. I want to show you what they do quickly. Earlier, I had found a video. Oh. But apparently I've lost it. And so here it is back. There's a bunch of them, but actually, so is this 38 seconds? 38 seconds sounds like the right amount. So if you create an input pattern that is an image, and underlying this pattern, you have a recurrent neural network. Once you train the network by reinforcing the weights of the coactive pixels, and you then create an input pattern that is similar but not identical to one of the training patterns, basically a distorted version, and you train the network, you say start running, you see that it settles on a pattern that it has been trained. So what the guy here is doing, it's creating input conditions and running the network after training. There's no repeat on YouTube, is there? Training the network to then reproduce the output pattern. So every time that he presses start running, he falls into one of the pre-trained patterns. And so that's the idea of content addressable memory. That's the idea of looking into the clouds and seeing a face, is pareidolia, so-called. You are metaphorically imposing the patterns that you had previously stored in your brain as cats and dogs onto the clouds. And so this is one of the earliest recurrent neural network models that have been used to symbolize or metaphorically analogize to what the brain is doing. Very surprisingly, even though this is an incredibly simple network, this metaphor has stayed, and effectively in one of the videos that is in the channel that I've selected for you, and I'll link it. You will see how it's been used in the context of brain-computer interfaces. Some of you might know a master student in neurobiology called Romano van Genderen. He was my student. We used Hopfield networks to discover patterns in brains. So Hopfield networks are still used, even though they make very simple assumptions, and they're still very powerfully explanatory. Many of the analogies that we use now with high-dimensional attractors and spatial spatial temporal patterns go through them as representations of memory. We finish the lecture, so it's 12:46, and I would like to open for questions for today, for the future. Obviously, there is no Discord. I didn't, so this is the first time I've ever recorded and presented these lectures like this, so I apologize for the bumpy road we had behind us. I would have preferred to see you in person and to see your eyes and see how you're doing, and I think that we can get more interactivity that way. But I hope you've enjoyed the course. And if you would like me to focus on particular aspects or like explore something, bring it up in your project. Let us discuss it a little bit. And I'm looking very much forward to your questions now and to your presentations next week. So this is it for me. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And if you want to jump in and say hello or say something in the chat, feel welcome to for the next 5 minutes. So, did you enjoy the lecture? Did you learn something? Do you want to learn more about any of these things? I mean, I know that, you know, like in the spirit of the lecture, it's hard, but we dropped to 10 participants. So Thank you for sticking with me until the end. And I hope that you've learned something today. I think that these are the end of the lecture is potentially one of the most beautiful parts of the lecture and of this entire course. So, okay, so we do have a question, and it's a topical question. So, when would we use HOPFIELD, and when would we use an echo state network? An echo state network is particularly when we're trying to reproduce spatial temporal patterns. You want something that happens over time, like when you want to create the motion of an arm of a robot, when you want to produce a phonation sequence, blah, blah, blah. In fact, echo state networks are often used for production of speech. They're also used for BCI in terms of training it into data that happens over time. So spatial temporal patterns are echo states, and HOPFIELDs are single patterns. You want to retrieve a single pattern that looks most like the one that you've given. So you want to represent that kind of content addressable memory retrieval. In the HOPFIELD network, you don't have linear training of the weights. You have Hebbian learning, essentially. And in echo states, you're having a linear regression process. Good question, very topical, and I think that's a nice way to finish. So if there are more, keep on coming offline as well, also through the course. I'm going to put the lecture snippets online as soon as they're ready from Zoom. Talk to you soon, and have a great time. Nice to see everybody, and or not. And I'll see you in the coming course or next week. Bye-bye.